Thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar on What About Boys, led by Iain Mahony. Before I formally introduce our speaker this evening, I wanted to signpost our next webinar, which will be our final webinar before the end of the academic year. And this will focus on how to get your teenager to open up to you. We really hope you can join us. Now, over to our speaker this evening, who is a familiar face here at Forest. Iain has conducted previous webinars, so please do view this on our YouTube channel. Iain has also conducted many talks to our pupils and continues to be a firm favourite by the pupils due to his fantastic content of his sessions. He's actually due to speak to Year 10 pupils later on this month. Iain went to Uppingham School, where he was outwardly successful in the rugby teams, on stage, a school prefect and a house captain. At Manchester University, he graduated with honours. Iain entered the city and secured a dream job as a personal trainer in Mayfair. However, behind the scenes, he was in crisis, and his drug and alcohol use were out of control. Iain's confident demeanour hid his demons well: low self-worth, anxiety, and a desperate desire to please others. To ease the pain, for over a decade, he was habitually using cocaine, weed, and alcohol. Slowly crashing at 32, he was admitted to a rehabilitation centre. Having got the professional help he needed, Iain has been clean and sober for over 10 years. Iain has dedicated himself to understanding the various challenges of growing up. Iain's talks help pupils, parents and teachers to address sensitive issues safely and effectively. Iain's style is easy to relate to, free from judging or preaching, and the talks encourage people to open up and have those difficult conversations. Welcome, Iain. Thank you so much.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. And obviously, thank you very much for viewing if you check in later. As we just said in the introduction, the goal for all of my sessions is to try and relay relevant, helpful information to you in a way that's objective and open, rather than claiming to have the panacea or the solution. And this was not a talk that I was initially going to explore, because I didn't feel like I was particularly qualified to do that. And the BSA approached me and asked me if I would design a talk about masculinity. There are a number of different talks from providers for independent schools. As far as I'm aware, all of them have a really, really good message. And the wonderful thing is that we all come at this from a slightly different perspective. My goal when I developed the talk was to try and do as much research as possible. And the thing which was very interesting, but also slightly alarming, was the sheer volume of information across the different facets that we're going to talk about tonight. And I have tried to sort of accumulate as much relevant information as possible. And I want to sort of be the conduit to pass that on to you. And at the end of the talk, there will be a number of evidence-based solutions that you can implement. Just before we get there at the end, rather than looking at that and sort of feeling slightly overwhelmed or intimidated by this big list of things, I would say that it's very much designed to be like a menu in a restaurant. You're not supposed to pick every single dish. The idea is that there will be different things on there that are appropriate and relevant for different people in different circumstances. So the first thing which I wanted to look at when I was asked to develop this is, why is there a need to have a talk about modern masculinity at the moment? And the best data that I could find has shown that if we look at the current climate in the UK, and particularly within the independent sector, but broadly within UK kids who are sort of primary, secondary, and arguably university education age, we have a situation where there are a number of very controversial and very emotive subjects which have all sort of collided at the same time. All of the schools that I speak at have said that to varying degrees, one of the problems with the legacy of COVID is that all of the schools at the time, understandably, had to prioritise the A-level and GCSE pupils. And the problem was that there wasn't really the time or the experience, because it was such a novel incident, to accurately forecast or predict what would happen to the younger pupils as they matured. And the evidence, both anecdotally and from all the experts in social psychology, is that one of the big problems with the legacy of COVID for young men and young women, but particularly for young men, as we'll talk about a little bit later, they tend to mature a little bit more slowly anyway. On average, boys now that are in year 10 and year 11 are behaving more like boys generally. There will always be outliers, but they would generally be behaving more like boys in year 8 or year 9. And as a result, there is this delayed maturity, extended adolescence, whatever you want to call it. Boys are not maturing socially as quickly. The other problem that's come along with it is Me Too and everyone's invited. Understandably, we had a pretty serious problem, both at school age and in broader society, with cultural norms and expectations around the way that certain men, and I think it's very, very important to highlight that, it is certain men were behaving towards women. I think most people, I'm 44, and I think most of my friends that I've spoken to and most of the parents that I've spoken to would agree that growing up when we were at school, going to university, in the workplace, there were certain lazy cultural norms that a lot of people weren't really questioning, which were unhelpful and certainly needed to be addressed. But beyond that, there was clearly a layer of behaviour which was much more misogynistic, domineering, deeply unpleasant in certain instances. And quite rightly, that was called out and it was addressed. The problem, again, looking at the evidence and also anecdotally dealing with the number of schools that I deal with every year, is that the boys that are currently, particularly sort of pre-year 10, year 11, these boys are kind of moving into a situation where they're almost being held accountable for a legacy problem for people that were much, much older than them. And as a result, there is a tendency in certain circles culturally to almost start shaming and blaming young men who are growing up, who are not directly responsible for what's happened, but are almost guilty by association purely for the fact that they've got this immutable characteristic that they're male. And I think whilst there is a necessary recalibration, certainly for people who are sort of 25 and above, we need to be very, very careful that we don't start having a prejudicial view towards all boys and all men, whilst acknowledging the fact, as we'll look at later, that there has become a fairly extreme faction within masculinity, which unfortunately is the one group that we're trying to be reached. And ironically, they're the one group who are probably the least interested and the least willing to acknowledge or amend their behaviour. The other problem is that if you look at the UK independent sector, particularly, clearly we all know that the pressure, there is an unfortunate, again, sort of prejudicial, stigmatized view of private school pupils and parents, which is that they are all so affluent that school fees are no problem and kids are generally quite spoilt and indulged and they have whatever they want and they've got access to this amazing network of opportunities and they've got all the connections and all the advantages that pupils in the state sector don't have. And of course, that's going to be true for some pupils some of the time. I know that there are a number of private school parents who have to make enormous sacrifices to send one or more of their kids to a private school. And as a result, that can put an enormous amount of pressure on the parents. Then inadvertently, that can be passed on to the kids. And we also have a situation where within the private school sector, having been privately educated myself and doing a lot of work with independent schools, yes, they have all those connections, advantages and opportunities. They also have a lot of expectation, competition and pressure. And that combined with the added pressure of the VAT increase means that privately educated pupils are arguably under a greater amount of stress than they were previously. And the other things that I think it's really important to factor in as well, if we look at social media and we look at reality TV, unfortunately, to do this talk, I'm sort of not claiming to have some sort of intellectual superiority. A lot of the reality TV that I've watched, things like The Only Way Is Essex, Made in Chelsea, Love Island, I think they're designed to be relatively inane and vacuous. And the thing that I really picked up from watching them is that they encourage people to be completely self-absorbed and vacuous and very, very image-centered. Everything is around how people look, and there is a tendency for these programs to encourage people to be very, very fractious and argumentative and then make up and move on. But it almost seems like this sort of indiscriminate thing where people will fall out and then make up, and you can't quite work out who's friends with who or what the problem was. And there doesn't seem to be any real depth or clarity to it. But the main thing that I would say I take away from it is that there is a very, very unhealthy emphasis and bias towards how people look. So it isn't about how kind you are, how thoughtful you are, how empathetic you are. If you're competent at a certain skill, the only thing which is sort of rewarded or acknowledged is superficially how attractive you are, and it's obviously kind of adhering to a very narrow definition of what constitutes being attractive or good looking. So I think that's really, really problematic. And if we look as well at the economy, clearly we all know that the economy is in a pretty interesting place. In 1997, the average house in the UK cost about 3 times the average national salary. And in 2023, the average house in the UK was 11 times the average national salary. Wages have been stagnant in real terms since the 1970s. So every adolescent cohort throughout time has had certain unique challenges to contend with. I would say that the fact that we have a lot of social and economic problems going on at the same time, in conjunction with the fact that we now have irrefutable evidence that social media and technology are having a very, very detrimental impact on mental health and well-being, and young people's willingness and desire to kind of interact and engage on a face-to-face level, all of those things are kind of creating a perfect storm. And for young men, there is this complete ambiguity around how to behave, what's acceptable, and rather like the kind of the beauty standards of being on reality TV, we now seem to have sort of got to a point where people are desperately trying to define masculinity. And as I'll look at a little bit later, I don't think we need to have a rigid definition of what being a man is. I think there are many, many ways of being masculine. What we need to do is try and treat each other as much as possible as human beings with feelings and with needs, and recognize that there are going to be certain points where there will be young men where potentially boisterous, thoughtless behavior can cross over into something that's a little bit more nefarious and can become quite obnoxious and cruel. But we also need to factor in the fact that that is part of growing up. And I'm not trying to minimize or justify bad behavior or sexist behavior or bullying, but I think we would be in delusional or in denial if we didn't acknowledge the fact that everybody, when they go through adolescence, has to make a number of mistakes. And when we look at the adolescent trajectory, aside from all of the things that I've just talked about, we're in a situation where the idea for anybody going through adolescence, regardless of their gender, is that they transition from being a dependent child before puberty, where they have very little autonomy, very little freedom, and everything, understandably and quite rightly, is pretty much controlled by school and by parents. They then go through the adolescent phase when they're teenagers, where they become far more fiercely independent, and they want to have a lot more autonomy. They want to develop their identity, start developing beliefs and values about who they are and what they want to be. And the ideal goal is that by the time they get to their mid to late 20s, full brain maturation happens at around 27. The idea is that they would then transition into being what's called an interdependent adult. So somebody who is reasonably resilient and has a degree of fortitude and life experience, but is also self-aware enough and open enough to know that if they're going through something that's outside of their capacity, they feel able to get help, whether that's from a partner, a friendship group, a colleague, from HR, or from a trained professional. So that would be the ideal goal. The issue that we have now, unfortunately, is that going through adolescence is much, much harder. And there are a couple of wonderful experts in the field. One of them is called Jonathan Haidt, and I would really encourage you to read his books if you get the chance, or watch any of the podcasts that he's on if you don't have time to read the whole book. And his point is that going through adolescence used to be an opportunity to make what he called low-cost mistakes. So you learn how to negotiate, how to fail, how to compromise, how to succeed with a degree of humility, and also how to socialize and become part of a group at school, and develop theory of mind, which effectively means that going from the age of about 7 to 14, you start to recognize and understand that you're not the center of the universe, and that your thoughts and opinions and feelings are not universal, and learning how to negotiate and navigate those difficult relationships, as we all have to at school. The problem is now social media has added a huge amount of pressure. I have a friend who works in corporate finance, and I didn't realize that they now have a small team within HR, and part of their remit is to go back and do a sort of forensic analysis of people's social media. And he said that it's not common, but it's also not rare that they have instances where people who've got very, very good CVs, very good experiences, have unfortunately got something in their social media account from when they were much, much younger, and that will preclude them from getting a job. So I think it's very important to point out that there are lots and lots of consequences potentially down the line for posting things on social media when you're younger. And also, if somebody's sick at a party, or they get rejected by a girl, or they have an argument with someone, all of these things can be magnified and intensified by social media. So we're definitely in a situation where going through adolescence is much, much harder. And I believe this generation have a unique set of problems. It doesn't mean that they need to be pardoned or excused, and it doesn't mean that they get a pass, or that they're sort of inoculated from problems, because they're going to have to deal with them. But I think it is important to point out that they have a new set of problems. It doesn't mean that they're worse, but I think they are different to the problems that previous generations have had. The main two groups that we're going to talk about, and this is the only slide that I use in all of my talks, if you look at the literature around a healthy teenager, and particularly a healthy teenage boy, the words that tend to come up for describing somebody who is a healthy teenager is somebody who's direct, passionate, authentic. They tend to have, ideally, certain interests and hobbies that they get really, really invested in, and they have a sort of zest for life and an enthusiasm. And of course, I don't want to sound like I'm living in this sort of utopian delusion. We all know as well that teenagers can be surly and moody and withdrawn and difficult. I'm saying that what we want at times is for them to start feeling that they have this authentic expression of who they are, and they start to develop their own identity. The only slide that I use is this one across all three of my talks. It's developed by somebody called Dr. Tom Boyce in America. And his research tells us that everybody in the world, regardless of their ethnicity and their gender, falls into one of these two groups. 80% of people are dandelions, the yellow flower, and 20% of people are orchids, which is the pink flower. And his research tells us that dandelions, the 80%, are much more robust and resilient at baseline, and they tend to fill the massive grey area in the middle of life. The orchids, the 20%, the main thing that differentiates them from the dandelion at baseline is their level of sensitivity to environmental stress and change. So as a result, they need very, very specific conditions to flourish and to grow, which is why you will often see dandelions growing between cracks in pavements. And Dr. Boyce's work tells us that dandelions generally do about the same in terms of their outcomes, regardless of whether they're having problems at school or problems at home, whereas the orchids tend to have very, very extreme outcomes. So I'm an orchid, as we heard at the start of the talk, I'm in recovery. And I would say one of the things that I've taken real solace from is that orchids can have incredibly bad outcomes and end up at the bottom. But the interesting thing is that the people at the absolute top in terms of outcomes professionally and personally are always the orchids, but they do need more care and more attention to flourish, because they have that sensitivity to stress, to noise, to uncertainty, to change. And again, it doesn't mean that they need to be wrapped up in cotton wool, because that's not a viable solution for life. It just means that they need more nurturing and more care, and potentially a bit more time when they're going through a difficult experience. But if they are given that time and attention, they will often flourish. In the context of this talk, if we look at the two groups broadly, and again, it's important to point out, clearly, people have said to me at the end of the talk, I think my son or my daughter is kind of somewhere between the two. And both of these things are on a continuum. You're going to have people who are extreme orchids and extreme dandelions, and then you're going to have people who kind of are more divergent in the middle. But broadly speaking, they are quite useful classifications for putting people into groups. If you have a healthy dandelion, they tend to be the boys at school who are the kind of conventional, I don't want to use the word stereotypical, but they would be a more conventional boy, into sport, into music, loud, taking the piss, big group of friends, possibly have to be told off a little bit more often because their behavior can be a little bit louder or a bit insensitive, but they're generally quite bold, passionate, and they can be really, really helpful members of a year group. They tend to be quite strong and quite opinionated. They are the boys who at the moment, if they're not happy and they are feeling that they are being judged or marginalized or criticized purely for the fact that they're male, and anything that they do is being perceived to be, and again, we're going to have to use the T word, which I try and avoid, but if they're constantly being labeled as being toxic because they're loud and they like sport and they occasionally say things that are a little bit inappropriate, they are the people that are gravitating more towards the kind of, we could call it the hyper-masculine influences within the manosphere. And they are subscribing to a model broadly, which is being called strength through suppression. And the strength through suppression model, everyone watching this will have heard of people like Andrew Tate. They may have seen the documentary with Louis Theroux and other influences in the manosphere. The strength through suppression model effectively says to young men, the problem that you're going to have is if you listen to people who criticize you, and if you're vulnerable, if you're weak, if you're too placid or too amenable, you will get walked all over. And the only way that you will be successful and happy and well off and look good is to make sure that you avoid vulnerability and you never open up, you never show any weakness. And they're taking traditional masculine traits like competence and being calm and reliable and steady and successful and pragmatic, and they're turning those traits into something very, very unpleasant, which is becoming quite cruel, quite cynical, very ruthless and relentless, and it's constantly about the acquisition of money and power. And the strength through suppression model is sort of marketed as modern day stoicism. And the thing which I think it's really important to point out is that the Stoics never talked about denying feelings. They talked about accepting the situation, but they also talk very much about having an awareness of the problem because you were analysing it and understanding it. They didn't say that you need to lock your feelings in a cupboard. And the interesting evidence with all of the people that subscribe to the strength through suppression model is that they are the people when they get to their 30s and 40s who report being the most unhappy, the most unfulfilled, and also the angriest. But they often don't have the vocabulary or the willingness to open up and engage because they've got to a point in their life where they've spent so long trying to pretend to be robust and immune to criticism that they can end up being very, very angry and very lonely when they get to middle age. And we could call that, of the two, acting out. So the people that are in the strength through suppression model, they are sort of acting out against what they perceive to be hostile criticism towards being male. The orchids, the more sensitive boys, they can be very creative, very analytical, very thoughtful. They can act as a wonderful counterbalance to the orchids because they are quieter and more reflective and more sensitive. As part of the year group, they can often add a healthy amount of perspective, and they can be, I think, a nice antidote. They can almost be the sort of, not the ice to the fire, but they can present something a little bit calmer, a little bit more emotional, and not be quite so hyper rational about everything. And they are the boys, if they're not fulfilled and they're not happy, who are effectively opting out. The dandelions are acting out and the orchids are opting out. And that means they are getting more and more reluctant to take risks because they are frightened of being perceived badly and they don't want to upset people. They don't want to be rejected or humiliated. They are becoming what's called comfortably numb, and they are sort of going into a model which is being called the sort of the male sedation hypothesis, which means they are finding comfort, online, gaming, smoking weed, and they are the sort of people who, when they get to potentially their early to mid-20s, they haven't had a relationship, they're struggling to get a job, and they are possibly beginning to fall into that thing which is called paralysis by analysis. They're overthinking everything so much because they're so worried about making a mistake that by the time they get to their mid-20s, and everyone has a different trajectory through life. I didn't have my first serious girlfriend until I was in my early 20s. But the point is that as a group, that they're not necessarily, that they're not waiting to have a relationship from choice. They're sort of actively avoiding having one because they are so worried around things like consent and how they're perceived. And we can see that both of those two models, if those two are harnessed and they're happy, both in isolation and in conjunction with each other, that they can have a really sort of harmonious outcome as groups. If they are unhappy, you're often going to end up with a situation in a classroom or a school where the dandelions tend to be the louder, more aggressive bullies, and the dandelions are potentially going to just shrink and avoid any conflict, any sign of rejection or risk. They are very, very averse to both of those two things. And you end up with two cohorts of boys who are potentially not going to be in a very good place. But obviously we have to remember that the dandelions are 80%, so they are going to completely overwhelm and drown out the orchids, who are just going to fade into obscurity. So these are the topics we're going to talk about. The talk was originally designed to be 90 minutes long. Don't worry, it's not going to be 90 minutes tonight. It is going to be an hour. As a result, I'm going to try and go through things and be as concise as possible. I hope I don't miss out on any nuance, but I think if we cover these things, I should be able to give everything the appropriate amount of time. My email address and things will be available. So if you have any follow-up questions, you're obviously welcome to contact me if you feel like there's anything that you wanted to know more about afterwards. So the first topic that schools wanted me to talk about was mental health. We have a very complicated relationship in this country with mental health. As a result, we have a situation where we have three different things which are often conflated together, particularly by the younger generations. If we look at mental health and we look at mental illness and we look at mental fitness, they are three things which are often just conflated into one thing. Mental health is something that everybody has, and mental health can broadly be defined as somebody's emotional, physical, psychological, and social well-being, and that's going to fluctuate and oscillate day to day, a bit like the weather. And the idea with somebody's mental health is that it will have an effect on the way that they engage with themselves, with other people. It can be broadly measured by how somebody's sleeping, their mood, their energy, how much they can concentrate, their willingness to go out, obviously based on the fact that some of us are going to be more inclined to do that if we're an introvert or an extrovert. But everybody has mental health. Mental illness is clearly a more extreme end of the spectrum. And for somebody to have a mental illness, that would need to be diagnosed by a clinician or by somebody with appropriate training. People can't just say, I have a mental illness. They may have, but that is something that would need to be diagnosed by somebody with the relevant qualifications and training. And mental fitness is rather like physical fitness. Mental fitness is what are the things that we're doing to try and optimize and improve our health. There's been a bit of backlash with somebody called Stephen Bartlett, who's got a podcast called Diary of a CEO. And he is somebody at the moment who is facing a little bit of criticism because he is taking mental fitness and he's almost turning it into this sort of awful ordeal or this trial where everyone has to optimize their sleep and their energy and their resting heart rate and their heart rate variability. And are they eating enough of the 30 fruit and vegetables every week? There is an argument for saying that mental fitness at its extreme, a bit like physical fitness, can become something which becomes unhealthy. But mental fitness would be anything from meditating, journaling, making time to make sure that you are taking an appropriate amount of care and responsibility for your mental health. The problem that we have sort of intergeneration is that my dad, who I've talked to about this talk, and I love my dad dearly, but we're very, very, he's pretty extreme dandelion. I'm pretty extreme orchid. And my dad is an 82-year-old. His view is that everybody under the age of 25 needs to shut up, pull their socks up. Everybody's got a gluten intolerance and a mental health problem. And in my days, it was just chocks away and we all just bloody well got on with it, spirit of the dam busters. Clearly that lacks nuance. And I know that in his generation, people probably were a little bit more resilient out of necessity. But I don't think we can apply that as a blanket approach for dealing with people who are feeling sad or stressed or anxious. Equally, the thing that I'm again picking up both anecdotally and also from all of the evidence that I'm reading is that the younger generation, and I'm talking kind of 21 and under, the Gen Z population, that demographic, unfortunately, are starting to weaponize mental health and mental illness. And in some respect, I think there could be a degree of manipulation in there that people are saying, I can't do this because it will start to impact on my mental health, which of course is like a checkmate for anybody with a conscience because they don't want to make anyone mentally ill or traumatize someone or damage their mental health. But the thing I try and point out to young pupils when I speak to them in schools is, of course, we all need help if we're struggling with our mental health or with a mental illness. Equally, if somebody is feeling stressed before an exam or they're feeling angry because one of their friends was really rude to them in front of a group of people and they don't know why, or somebody feels sad because they've gone through a bereavement or the end of a relationship, those are perfectly normal physiological responses to an environmental stressor. And I worry that people now of that age are starting to associate any negative emotion as being a problem that needs to be addressed rather than a life obstacle that needs to be acknowledged and dealt with and moved through. But we do have a problem around mental health. In the UK, 60% of that demographic would not be comfortable crying in front of another boy. I'm not saying that you need to cry to show that you're feeling sad or stressed or anxious. You absolutely don't. We're all human beings and we have different ways of responding to problems. What I am saying is that it's the fact that such a large proportion of those boys would be uncomfortable. It's not that they just don't cry because it's not their way of processing emotion. It's the fact that they're worried about the stigma associated with crying. And the statistic underneath is broadly around my age group, about 35 and over in the UK. The best evidence is that 92% of suicides were already in therapy and 80% were classified as low risk, which tells me that there is a large group of men who, even though they are arguably in the most appropriate setting, they still don't feel willing or able to divulge the full extent of their turmoil and their problems. In the UK, there is currently a suicide every 90 minutes. And for every completed suicide, it's an unpleasant way of describing it, but that's the terminology they use. For every completed or successful suicide attempt, there are 25 unsuccessful attempts. And at the moment, 80% of suicides are male. So that's increasing. The literature varies slightly, but it's increasing from 75 to 80. And it's going to go over 80%, they think, by about 2035. So we clearly have a problem where men are not able to open up in front of people. And the other stat, which is really, really sad, is that in 1992 or 1993, it was around 3% of UK males said that they didn't have a single friend. And last year, that statistic has risen to 15%. So it's 15% of men say that they don't have a single friend who they can open up with, socialise, or talk to. So we clearly have a problem. And when we look at this, we see that generally the dandelions are not going to respond as well to therapy as the orchids will. Typically, there's really good research that's come out of Scandinavia, and it says that, again, with talks like this, we always have to deal in generalizations. There will always be outliers. What we're talking about, because it's too broad to go into every nuance and exception within the session, is the general population. Within the general pop, you will find that the majority of adolescent teenage girls that go into therapy and people who are non-binary or transgender, generally, they will have a better ability to articulate and explain how they are feeling. So there are certain problems with people like Andrew Tate, we'll talk about him a little bit later, and other people in the manosphere who make very, very unhelpful, inaccurate, sweeping generalizations about the difference between men and women, one of the things which is proven biologically is that generally women are more articulate, they're more eloquent, and they are more verbally dexterous, and they are also more open, whereas men tend to be better at systemizing, and they can be a little bit more rational, a little bit more objective, but they don't necessarily have the rich internal dialogue to explain how they're feeling, and particularly to a stranger. And as a result, the reason I've put these 3 pictures up is because if we look at the first image, the person on the far left, we would probably agree that he looks very dejected, forlorn, sad. He is the sort of person that we would look at and say he looks depressed. Generally, if he goes into therapy, if he's a dandelion, his reaction is going to be more like the picture in the middle, which is somebody who's potentially going to be quite hostile, quite confrontational. And there is a lot of evidence in this Scandinavian research that a lot of dandelions, if they go into therapy or they have a conversation with a male teacher or with a parent, they can find a direct conversation, physically direct conversation face to face, feels like a test or a confrontation. And as a result, it doesn't work very well. And if they're feeling stressed or frightened or angry, they won't be able to articulate how they're feeling. And as a result, they can start to get more flustered, and it can actually just exacerbate the underlying problem. The boy on the end would be more of an orchid, somebody who is so desperate, even if people are taking the piss and he's feeling shy and insecure and anxious, trying to present as being happy and relaxed because they don't want to upset people. And both of those 2 images are equally problematic. I would say from everything I've seen and everything I've read that the orchids often respond better to counselling. They have a more feminine response. If you look at the sort of the 2 demographics, the orchids will generally respond more like a woman in therapy. It can be a relief to open up and articulate and explain how they're feeling, and that is called communion. It's talking, it's opening up, and it's relating and identifying to another person. The boy in the middle, the dandelion. The dandelions generally do a lot better with what's called agency rather than communion. Agency is activity. And that means if you've got someone who is a dandelion and they're pissed off and they're angry and they're getting more and more escalated, the worst thing you can do potentially is to sit them down and try and talk to them. Going out for a walk, doing some sort of physical activity will really, really help. And the other thing which is really interesting from somebody called Richard Reeves is he says that most men deal much better with shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. And the number of male teachers who have said to me, and parents, do you know, I never knew why I found it so much easier to have a difficult conversation with my wife when I was in the car. And it's because it isn't face to face and it isn't as confrontational. So generally with the orchids, conventional therapy will help, and having an open conversation will help, but not pressurizing. And with the dandelions, physical activity, getting out, moving, walking, and avoiding face-to-face direct confrontation, and not probing and not interrogating, asking questions, but doing it in a way when you're almost doing another activity. So if you're cooking, playing football, going for a walk, it can take the pressure off. And the final thing I would say about the dandelions particularly is that for a lot of men and for a lot of boys, and there's a lot more work coming out around this now in the recovery space and in sort of male mental health in general, a lot of men are opening up about the fact that because they struggle with expressing vulnerability and sadness, they find it much easier to go to anger, because anger feels like a much more dynamic masculine emotion, rather than admitting that I feel scared, I feel frightened, I feel insecure, I feel anxious. And it's really important to point out that quite often underneath a lot of anger is fear. But people are obviously capable of feeling angry because they're angry, but it's giving people the space and the time to express themselves clearly without applying too much pressure. The next thing, I would say this is probably the biggest problem in terms of, I would say that this is the issue which is potentially going to be the most problematic in the next decade, if it hasn't already got there, which is, as I said at the start, pornography, which we're going to talk about later, and also social media are perpetuating body standards which are completely ridiculous for young men. women have had totally unrealistic, totally unfair, horrible, rigid beauty standards applied to them for generations. And unfortunately, rather than learning our lesson and removing those pressures, all we've done is just apply them to men in the same way. And as a result, the chap here is called Adam Collard. He is a contestant on Love Island. And that, from all of the personal trainers that I spoke to, who were kind of, I did a sort of poll of men in the gym and personal trainers, and they said that that is the kind of physique that most men would be aspiring to now in terms of social media and how they think they should look. I have competed as a bodybuilder several times. So that's the leanest I've ever been. And that was 4 years ago. So I was 40 in that picture. Completely natural, no drugs, no growth hormone. That picture is a slightly more extreme picture than that one. Not by much. It's probably another 4 weeks of suffering, of dieting. But that picture was achieved by manipulating salt, water, and lighting. And I looked like that. That's not photoshopped. That is how I looked. And I looked like that for about 2 hours. And even if I had taken steroids, I have taken steroids in the past. Even if you take steroids, all that would generally do is make you a slightly bigger version of the same thing. But there are certain drugs which will help you burn body fat, which are very, very bad for you. But generally that physique, I mean, I've got pretty decent genetics for building muscle. I haven't got great genetics for getting lean. So I had to really, really suffer to get there. And the thing I would say to all of them is, what does it require? Is it realistic? And is it sustainable? The best evidence coming out of Australia, someone called Scott Griffiths, is young men are effectively falling into a trap, and it's one of two things. One of them is a perceptual distortion. Perceptual distortion would include anything like bulimia or anorexia, where somebody looks in the mirror and obviously their perception is distorted. They don't see how they look to the rest of the world. The other thing, which is equally insidious and problematic, is what's being called the tyranny of progress. And the tyranny of progress is where somebody says, I know how I look, but it's not good enough. And it doesn't matter that I've got a bit bigger. I want to get a bit leaner. And now I've got a bit leaner. I want my back to be bigger, and I want my biceps to be bigger, and I want my triceps to poke out of my t-shirt, and I want more veins on my forearms. And it's this never-ending process where people keep moving the goalposts. And because it is the tyranny of progress, they never feel happy. Interestingly, the things that he describes, which actually is very relevant for the mental health thing, I was going to come back to that later, but we'll talk about that now. The words that he describes as being the two words which are the ultimate red flags, both in terms of body image and also mental health, is I feel worthless and I feel hopeless. And he says if anybody's talking about their physique or their mental health and they say either of those two words, whether they're consciously aware of it, that is generally a sign, worthless particularly, that somebody is in a very, very bad place. And clearly the word worthless is very extreme to an adult, but he's saying from all the literature, worthless and hopeless are the two words to really take action when somebody is feeling that way. And his view is that because social media and reality TV are perpetuating these images, people are becoming more and more inclined to believe that they have to look a certain way. To look that way, if you're under the age of 25 and you're natural, isn't going to happen unless you're 1% of the population with amazing genetics. And it requires an enormous amount of sacrifice. And the last 4 weeks are, and I might say a little bit melodramatic to use the word torture, the level of suffering that has to be endured to get that lean is awful. And that doesn't matter whether you're on steroids, whether you're natural, whether you've got good genetics, whether you've got bad genetics. You're doing enormous amounts of exercise, you're eating very, very little food, and you're not sleeping, you have erectile dysfunction. Being around anyone for any prolonged period of time is completely unbearable. Any noise, any disruption of structure is completely unmanageable. And it's all to achieve a certain look for a photograph. And of course, I'm proud that I got to that point, and I'm glad that I've got the photo. But if people are thinking that there's anybody on the internet, natural or not, who's walking around looking like that all of the time, they're completely delusional. And they also have to remind themselves that in the same way that not everybody is going to be able to open a hedge fund, and not everybody is going to be able to play grade 8 violin, and not everyone's going to be a Michelin-starred chef or be an incredibly passionate, empathetic English teacher. Not everybody's going to have the genetics to look that way. But as a society, we have put this really, really odd, disproportionate emphasis on how people look. And I think it is a cultural, societal thing at the moment. I can remember when I was growing up, there was a big thing around skinny jeans, and women were size 0. And now the pressure on women is to have a very curvaceous, muscular figure. So I'm hoping that at some point, the completely unrealistic expectation for men to build enormous amounts of muscle and be very, very low body fat will change. But I think, unfortunately, we're still going into the problem. I think we're kind of in the eye of the storm. I don't think we're out of it yet. The interesting thing that the research tells us is that most people have what's called a spontaneous revision. And a spontaneous revision means that somebody who is completely obsessed with training in their teens or 20s, generally most people, when they get to their 30s and their lifestyle changes, they will generally kind of grow out of it, and they will just start to shift into different things like work and family and other hobbies. And the things that he talks about in terms of noticing whether somebody has a problem is it intrusive and is it a preoccupation? So he says if your son goes to the gym 4 times a week, he's constantly putting all of his food into an app on his phone, and he's eating loads of chicken breasts, drinking protein shakes, eating tons of 0-fat Greek yogurt with berries, and you say to him, oh, by the way, the holiday that we're going on next week, the gym's shut. They've just sent us an email and the gym's shut. If he says, oh, that's a bit annoying, and then gets on with his life, you've just got somebody who loves chicken breasts and bicep curls. You don't have somebody with a problem. If you say to somebody, the gym's shut, and they can't cope with it, that is the sign of having the intrusive preoccupation, where it's starting to interfere with their day-to-day life. But it isn't always a direct correlation between how meticulous they are with their diet and how much they like training. It is very much the impact that it's having on their life and whether it starts to consume them rather than being a hobby. Supplements, unless a child, obviously sort of using the legal term, under the age of 18, unless somebody is playing county or regional sport or international sport, there is absolutely no need for anybody under the age of 18 to be taking supplements. To put your mind at rest, if they are taking them, it probably isn't going to do them a huge amount of damage. It's a waste of money. The one that they definitely don't need is protein. The best research from America, from somebody called Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who is the world's most eminent expert on protein metabolism, all of her research says that the one group who need to eat lots and lots of protein are the one group who don't. And the one group that don't need lots of protein are the ones that consume far too much of it. So over 70, people's protein requirement massively increases. And under 20, muscle metabolism, muscle growth is all being driven by resistance training and by hormones, by your natural hormonal cascade. So people absolutely don't need to be taking protein, because effectively all they're doing is just peeing it all out again. So it's important to point out for teenagers, eating a healthy, balanced diet and making sure that you're training, that will be the catalyst for muscle growth and being lean, not guzzling lots and lots of supplements. Steroids are something which I talk about in another talk. I don't think Forest is the sort of school, and I may be wrong. I speak at some schools that have a very strong bias towards sports, particularly rugby, and I think there is more of a problem in those schools potentially with people having more of an inclination towards taking steroids. Unfortunately, the number of steroid users in the UK has risen over the last 20 years from about 50,000 to about 1 million. So there are lots and lots of people taking steroids. If your child is changing rapidly and drastically, that would be the time to have a conversation. But I would say that it would be very rare for somebody to be taking steroids and for you not to notice a pronounced change in their physique. And that would either be becoming much, much bigger and bulkier in a short space of time, or becoming much more vascular and veiny and muscular in a sort of lean, athletic, 100-meter sprinter type way. But there's no way that they would be taking them and you wouldn't notice changes in their body and also in their temperament. And these are the things, nobody really talks about this because it can't be monetized. You can't sell, well, obviously you can sell Evian water, but you get the point. It's much easier to sell a training program or a very sort of elaborate looking substance with a weird name like Muscle Fuel 500, rather than saying to somebody, get lots of sleep, drink lots of water, be patient, and do progressive overload. And the one thing I would say with this generation, particularly because of social media, is they are incredibly impatient. And that is why there is this tendency to try and take shortcuts. And the main thing which will get you a good physique, and it's probably the main thing in life which will get anyone anywhere, is consistent application. Training ridiculously hard for 4 weeks and then getting injured and taking 2 weeks off is a far less appropriate strategic approach than training 3 times a week sensibly and doing that for a year. And the best thing I ever heard on that was that most people drastically underestimate what they can achieve in 10 years, but they also drastically overestimate what they can achieve in 1 year. So I think it's very, very important to point out to young people when they're trying to develop their physique, most of the people they're looking at are much older than them. They've got very good genetics. It's potentially their job. And they're also being monetized to do it, and they may be taking performance-enhancing drugs. So I think it's just being open and honest and avoiding judgment and having those conversations. And this was the main thing. Most studies are saying it's the definition of body dysmorphia, unfortunately, is not clearly defined across all the literature, but they're now saying that men and women broadly have parity in terms of the diagnosis of body dysmorphia. And 79% of women are struggling to find a partner who is intellectually compatible. They're not struggling to find someone with big enough biceps. This is the part of the talk which I have probably had the most problems with. And the reason why I've had problems is that I think ideally schools and parents at this point would like me to launch into this very impassioned polemic about how awful the manosphere is and how awful Andrew Tate is. And as I said at the start of the talk, the problem with this approach towards masculinity is that the one group who need to listen and radically address and alter their behavior are the one group who are completely oblivious to it and don't care. And soft signaling is one of the best approaches to use when you're approaching somebody who feels very passionate and defensive if they're a young man. And that means listening, active listening, engaging, being open, not going in with a preconceived idea of what you want the outcome to be. Because if you go in and you're very, very critical and you do this withering character assassination of someone like Andrew Tate, they will shut down before you've even finished your first sentence and you are wasting your breath. If you have an open, honest, critical conversation, but you listen to viewpoints and you offer counter viewpoints back, that is the only way that you're going to get a potential good outcome. Going in there all guns blazing and being really critical and aggressive, I promise you it will not get the result. And that is the problem with the Andrew Tate approach. A number of parents have come in, and I don't want to be rude because most parents are fantastic. Some parents have come in and they feel very, very passionately and they feel very protective of their sons and their daughters. And I absolutely respect them and I understand that completely. But they have misunderstood my approach to this as me justifying it or excusing it or trying to bright side what Andrew Tate is and what he represents. And I'm always very, very honest if anyone asks me. I think that their approach is incredibly insidious and incredibly unhelpful. My point is that why has Andrew Tate and people like Andrew Tate, why have they been able to gain such traction and gain such notoriety? And the answer is because they are opportunistic. Andrew Tate is, if you read what you can find around him, he's in a monogamous relationship. He's married with kids. anyone that knows him, that's hosted him on a podcast, says that when the camera stops rolling, he is a bright, funny, kind, polite individual who is playing a role. Does that make him any less insidious or problematic? No, arguably it makes him even worse, because he can't even hide behind the fact that he's an ideologue who's completely delusional. He has someone who had a very, very difficult upbringing. He is fairly ostentatious and vulgar with his wealth, and he is peddling a model of masculinity towards young men, which focuses on looks, money, status, and misogyny. And the problem is that the things that he talks about which are helpful are things like physical exercise, delayed gratification, and making sure that you're a better person than you were yesterday in terms of self-improvement. All of the things that he talks about, which are really, really hideous and problematic, are very, very evident in the rhetoric and the ideas that he sells to people. They're critical, they're rude, they're unkind. And I always just say to the male pupils, would you want somebody to treat your mum or your sister or your girlfriend the way Andrew Tate describes talking about women? And I think broadly the answer would be no. And as I said at the start, I think the best way to counter that is the soft signaling approach. And the reason why people like him have been able to come to prominence is there is so much ambiguity and so much uncertainty around how to be a male. And the best evidence is that young men absolutely need edges and boundaries. They need clarity. And the one thing that you get with someone like Andrew Tate or any of the other male influencers is that they are very emphatic and adamant and certain. And that is why they have been able to gain the traction that they've got, not because they've got particularly good ideas. Dating and consent, around 70% of relationships now start online. It's estimated that the ratios of online dating are now as high as 7-1. And 55% of men in that age bracket have not approached someone in the last year. And 50% of people in that age range are not actively pursuing any form of contact with the opposite sex. The biggest problem that we have for young men, and obviously I'm always very tactful and diplomatic when I actually mention this, but pupils are always very receptive and very mature when I talk to them. Young men and young women use social media differently. Young women generally use social media. Young men are using social media to watch porn. So the stats around pornography in the UK, a third of boys have seen it by the age of 10. The average age of watching it is 13. And around 80% of boys have seen what would be classified as really violent, degrading pornography by the age of 18. And it's around 30% of boys who have said that they are reenacting what they are seeing on screen. It's very important to point out that pornography now is not the same pornography that people used to watch in the 80s or the 90s. One of the big things that used to be an enormous barrier to watching it was the fact that it wasn't accessible. And now people can watch it on their phones. And I am always very clear and very open with the pupils that there is absolutely no difference between pornography's effect on the brain and on dopamine than there is between Class A drug use. And that's not me trying to be sensational or dramatic. The literature points out cocaine, crystal meth, and online pornography all have exactly the same effect on brain chemistry. And as a result, it is something that needs to be treated with a degree of caution and with a degree of care. And it is very, very important to point out to them that what they are watching on screen is a very distorted form of entertainment to generate money. It is not an accurate representation of people having sex. And understandably, if people are reenacting what they're watching on porn, and that is violent, degrading behavior, that is potentially going to lead them and also their partner to having a very, very complicated, difficult time. And these are the sorts of conversations that I think people need to be having openly and honestly, and taking away the embarrassment and the stigma. And it's also important to point out as well that young men's frontal cortex develops slower than girls, which means generally girls have a better braking system. Organization, motivation, discipline, and control is much stronger in young women. Men generally have a much more extreme tendency towards being impulsive, experimentation, and being reckless. And unfortunately, things like pornography, if they start watching it, it can very quickly become something that transitions from being an occasional recreational hobby to being something that can be compulsive, and they can develop a problem with it. Okay, these are solutions. I will try and wrap these up relatively quickly because I know we're nearly at the hour mark. Emotional intelligence would be the number one. That applies to men, that applies to women, regardless of your gender, whether you're a child, whether you're an adult, everybody needs to have good emotional intelligence. Effectively, that's the difference between reacting to something and responding. And ruler means recognize, understand, label, explain, and regulate. In short, it means giving people the time and the space to start understanding why they did something, what they could have done differently, and also developing a degree of self-control and self-awareness around what are the things that make me feel happy or angry or sad, and trying to manage those in a healthy way. But I think that is something that we need to approach over the whole course of adolescence and into people's early 20s. They're not going to get it when they're little, but it is like training or going to the gym. It is a muscle and it's a skill that can be developed and built over time. Dopamine management and healthy coping mechanisms are effectively the two ways of saying the same thing. Is somebody dealing with feeling stressed and angry and marginalized or lonely? Are they dealing with that by smoking weed or watching porn or playing loads of computer games or isolating from their friends? Or are they going for a run, going for a jog, having a stretch, making a smoothie, being mindful, stroking their dog, anything you can think of? These are the sorts of habits which sound very, very obvious, but they're the sorts of things that if you start doing them when you're 18 or 17, they become much more pronounced when you're in your 30s. Quality relationships is a big one. There's evidence from somebody called Robert Plomin, who wrote a book called Blueprint. When people become older, they do actually turn into their parents. So your gene expression becomes much more pronounced when you get to your 30s. Most of the people at school are going to be much, much more heavily influenced by their peer group than they are by their parents or by their genetics. So it's a very, very important thing to make sure that people are hanging around with friendship groups that reflect the values and the beliefs that they want to behave in. And my sponsor in AA always said to me, if you spend enough time in the barbershop, eventually you're going to get a haircut. And by that, he means if you're hanging around with people that are watching porn, being misogynistic, or just generally being unpleasant, eventually you're going to start acting out those behaviors, even if they're not your baseline. Competence is a big one. There is a very, very disproportionate emphasis with this generation around looks, money, and status. Funnily enough, across all cultures, the thing which is most attractive to mates, to potential partners, is actually kindness and competence. Being good at something, you don't have to earn £1 million. You don't have to have a six-pack. You can be a kind, conscientious, thoughtful person. And the thing which I think young men are failing to acknowledge is you can be competent in anything, but it's all about being emotionally mature. That is really, really attractive. Mentoring and counselling, both very, very big. As I said at the start in the talk, I think the dandelions generally do better with mentoring, whether that's with a peer or with a parent or with a family friend or teacher. And the orchids generally do better with a conventional counselling setup. And critical thinking is a very, very big thing. If a son expresses a view which sounds extreme or sounds unreasonable, it's giving them the time and the space and the respect to discuss that in a way that if they can't actually justify why somebody like Andrew Tate is an admirable person to look up to or try and emulate, it's allowing them to come to that conclusion by the fact that they've actually been open and able to talk about it, rather than feeling like they're going to get this very blunt, strong response before they've even had an opportunity to express their thoughts and feelings. So critical thinking and soft signaling go together. And the last one is being a role model. And it's reminding boys, particularly in years 11, 12, but mainly 12 and 13, that even though they are looking for role models, they are already role models. And even though they may be looking for people to emulate and look up to and copy, it's really important to point out to them that at school, as year 12 and year 13, they will already have a lived experience of what it was like to go through school and be treated nicely or be treated badly by people in those 2 year groups. And it's really important to point out to them that they already have a very important role to play in determining the kind of the culture and the dynamic within the school community. I'm very pleased I managed to keep that to nearly an hour. I'm sorry I went over by 3 minutes. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you found that helpful and relevant.